excited to sew, and I did tell you that the next video would be sewing, but actually I have to insert this video in between so that we can talk about two things that are super important for every sewer. One, your cutting implements, and two, your ironing board. So starting now, I am going to expect that you have all of your materials for these tutorial videos pre-cut and prepared before we even start. So you need to pay close attention so that you will know how to cut and prepare all of the materials that I'm asking for when you start your sewing videos. Did your mother ever tell you not to run with scissors? Well, you should definitely not run with scissors, but there's a whole lot of other things you should not do with scissors or other cutting implements like this rotary cutter. In fact, they can be quite dangerous. So before we start this part of the video, if you are not an adult, make sure that you get adult supervision, preferably the one who tells you not to run with scissors. That's the one we want. So I'll tell you what, I'll wait for a moment while you guys go run and get the person who tells you not to run with scissors, but don't do it while you're carrying scissors.
These are your three main cutting tools. As I mentioned in the Notions You Need video, this pair of scissors should only be used on fabric. Protect your fabric scissors at all costs from the evils of paper. It's good to have a small pair of scissors on hand for small, careful cuts and for clipping threads. You may choose to use a rotary cutter. I have to underscore, rotary cutters are dangerous tools. We took my son to the emergency room one time when he nearly cut a finger off with a rotary cutter. Rotary cutters have a built-in safety. Pull the knob down to reveal the blade or push the knob up to disengage the blade. It's imperative to push the knob up whenever the rotary cutter is not being used. Never leave the rotary cutter with the blade revealed, and always put the rotary cutter away when not in use. Never use a rotary cutter without a thick rotary cutter ruler and self-healing mat. Here's my rotary cutter ruler. I like that it's transparent, which helps when I'm measuring away from cut edges. This is my self-healing mat. They come in all sizes, but I recommend the 36 by 24 inch size because many projects require long lengths and it's very difficult to measure and use a rotary cutter when your mat isn't large enough. I'll demonstrate engaging the blade, but notice I immediately disengage the blade when it's not in use. I'm going to demonstrate how to cut the fabric pieces we will need for the next video, in which I will teach you fundamental sewing skills. These do not need to be any particular color, but should be a solid color. No prints. We will cut 3 6-inch wide strips. One 6-inch strip will have triangle and square cutouts for practicing corners. One will have round oval cuts for practicing curves, and one will just be the 6-inch wide strip for practicing straight sewing. You will also need to cut another 6-inch wide 2-layer strip of fabric out of a print. Each of these cuts needs to be doubled. There needs to be a top piece and a bottom piece because we'll be sewing two pieces together. It's easiest to do that by folding the fabric over and cutting both pieces at once. Each of the cuts I'll be showing you is the fabric folded over so that there are two identical pieces for each pattern piece. My ruler is 6 inches wide, so I just put the ruler on top of my fabric and run the rotary cutter right next to the straight edge. Each of my strips is 6 inches wide, but the length doesn't matter as much. Probably 18 to 24 inches is good. Let's see me cut this again. We will line the fabric up with the edge of the self-healing mat and then grab the ruler and match the edge. Once that's straight, check it again, line it up with the edge, and then run the rotary cutter right next to the straight edge of the ruler. Now I have two pieces of 6-inch wide by about 18-inch strips. Now let's cut our notched corner piece out of the purple fabric. First, we need to cut another 6-inch wide strip from the purple fabric. To make the cut shorter and a little easier to manage, I fold the fabric in half again, place the ruler on top of the fabric, lining it up with the edge of the fabric, and run the rotary cutter. This purple strip has 2 layers of fabric. Now we'll get out our sewing scissors and cut triangles and squares along the bottom. They should be rather large, but there's not a requirement for how many or what type. You just need a 2-layer strip 6 inches wide by about 18 inches long with a few points to sew around. Now let's cut the strip for practicing going around curves out of the blue fabric. I'll open the blue fabric so there are 2 layers. And then I'll cut another 6-inch wide strip. Then, to make equal curves on the ends of the strip, I will fold it in half lengthwise and use my sewing scissors to cut a curve on either side to make a 2-layer piece that looks like this. It looks like a big band-aid. Now you just need to cut 2 more 6 by 18 inch pieces out of a print, and then you'll have all of the pieces that you need for our first sewing project. This is a satin pillowcase project already cut 43 inches by 32 inches. You can see why a larger self-healing mat is preferable. That's a lot of fabric to manage. To manage all that fabric, I just folded it in half widthwise. To cut 32 inches, I like to fold it in half again and then line it up with the ruler on the mat, and then place my ruler on 32 inches and cut. You could make the same cut with sewing scissors and then fold the fabric lengthwise to make the 43-inch cut.
There is no reason whatsoever that you could not cut all of that stuff out with just a countertop or the floor or a good table and some great sewing scissors. It's just a little bit tedious, but I did that for many, many years. So if that's you, it'll look like this.
I would suggest a ruler or yardstick of some sort to help you with measurements. Measure your cut and make a small cut on the bottom of your fabric and also the top. Then draw a line with tailor's chalk or a tailoring pen. Actually, a pencil also works. And cut. In the future, you'll be learning to cut patterns with sewing scissors and pins, but for the purposes of learning, we'll just be cutting squares and rectangles.
So I'm going to briefly touch on an iron and an ironing board just to say that you cannot survive as a sewist without an iron and an ironing board. You're going to be pressing open so many seams, I can't even tell you. People who end up with projects that look bad, it's often just simply that they did not iron. The difference between great sewing and just amateur looking sewing often is just whether or not somebody pressed some seams open. It's important. I mean, what's the point of going to all that work if you're going to end up with something, that you don't want? So use an iron, have something look spectacular that everybody wants, that all your friends wonder where you got and want to buy it on Etsy. Let's talk about interfacing. That's another thing that you can do with your iron. So interfacing is like this cool little sewing magic trick. It's the way that professionals get a collar to stand up, for instance. So anytime you want to add a structure or a little bit more bulk or substance to your fabric, you just add interfacing. So if you want a collar to stand up, it's because there's interfacing in it. Or you notice that a waistband stands up and has a little more structure, it's because there's interfacing in it. You see a purse and it stands up and it has a little structure and it doesn't just fall down and be floppy, it's because there's interfacing in it. There are all types of interfacing. There are interfacings that have felt to them. There are interfacings that are sort of quilted. There are interfacings that are really heavy, and then also interfacings that are very light, depending on the fabric or what you're using them for. And I will walk you through each of those depending on the project that we're doing. But for now, let me just give you an example of some of the interfacings that you might be able to use.
If you look closely, you'll see the raised dots on two of these pieces of interfacing. Those raised dots are glue and will adhere to the fabric when they are ironed onto the fabric. The glue side needs to touch the fabric, not the iron. You just don't want glue all over your iron. You can trust me on that. Start by ironing your fabric pieces. If you iron interfacing onto wrinkled fabric, it will set the wrinkles in place. The first interfacing is a fusible fleece. It has a felt-like feel and adds bulk and soft structure to the fabric. Each interfacing is applied differently, and you should refer to the instructions that come with the interfacing. And there it is. If I fold it over, you should be able to see the added bulk and soft structure it gives to the fabric. The next piece is a featherweight fusible interfacing. The glue dots go down toward the fabric. After ironing it, you can see it is thinner than the last piece, but stiffer with more structure. Compare it to the fabric with no interfacing, and you can definitely see the difference interfacing makes. The final example has a shiny side rather than the raised dots. The glue gives the interfacing a sheen. The sheen goes down facing the fabric. After ironing, you should be able to see the difference between this and the featherweight piece. It's the stiffest of all the interfacings. So let's take a look at all these three different interfacings and compare them.
So that's a little bit about irons and ironing boards and scissors and rotary cutters and cutting implements. Basically all the really dangerous stuff about sewing. And it can be pretty dangerous. So don't send yourself to the hospital. If you are not an adult yet, this is definitely something to be doing with adult supervision. Be very, very careful when you're cutting, especially that rotary cutter. We sent my son to the hospital one time for nearly cutting his finger off. Those rotary cutters are very dangerous. So be careful. That said, make sure you check the video descriptions for each of my tutorials because it will list in the bottom exactly what the material requirements are and what needs to be cut and how large for each project from here on out. For instance, I think the upcoming satin pillowcase project requires a 43-inch by 32-inch piece of satin fabric. Anyway, you're gonna need to know that for all of the amazing projects we're gonna do from here on out.